Hello everybody, this is Tom in Los Angeles. Hope everyone is doing great this weekend and you're having a good weekend. I am going to comment and talk about the very enigmatic and mysterious and superb Canto 15 today of Dante's Inferno. And I'm gonna try and address at least a couple of the main topics and points that we can find about this canto. And I know that I usually tend to say every canto is superb and outstanding, but this particular canto has some elements, additional elements, in my opinion, of beauty than relative to the other ones that I would like to highlight. And it's the canto of Brunetto Latini, the famous character of Inferno, who belongs to the violent against nature, the so-called sodomites in Dante's world, and therefore it opened up an endless series of discussions in history that try to answer questions like, for example, what exactly did Dante mean by sodomites? Because he actually never even said the word sodomite in the canto. Why did he place this particular individual in this round or in this circle? Because there's not a lot of proofs. How did Dante conform or not conform with the historical lenses or cultural and social lenses of his time, and other questions that today is probably impossible to answer with certainty, but we can do some work around it and try to look into it. Let's start from, I would say, I would love to start from Dante's cultural attitude, because if you remember, we've already seen in a past canto of Inferno how, for example, in the Limbo canto, how he introduced three Muslim characters in a way that it was a positive light relative to the circumstance, and he didn't have to. Nobody in his time would have raised their hand and said, hey, you didn't include Averroe, Avicenna, and the Saladin in your canto, in your Limbo. So he did it out of his own decision. And that in itself speaks a lot already about Dante's mindset. His open-mindedness, for sure, that was in line with a certain cosmopolitan environment and cultural environment of the literate people of his time, but also individually about Dante himself. There is a certain misalignment between Dante's cultural attitude and his historic environment. Maybe especially when it comes to topics like homophobia, or at least what with today's lenses we see as homophobia in his times. Perfect example is in most of paintings and illustrations of last judgments. Let's take, for example, Giotto, who was a very famous painter in Italy. Sodomites in general and sexual sins were represented in the Last Judgment as with sexually graphic type of punishments, and everything that was represented in those paintings doesn't exist in the Divine Comedy. We don't see any type of sexualized punishment, which in itself is something that makes us think Dante has a little bit of outside the box type of imagination and sensitivity to start with, because again, nobody would have read his Inferno if he had put some sexualized punishments and very graphic and violent ones, even with those pinches and forks and terrible type of tortures that were applied in not only in art, in visual arts, but also in reality from the law in many places, and said, this is too much, this is really not good, you should have been a little more relaxed about it. Nobody, because that was the way to look at this type of thing. So It's all about his own sensitivity. There is a lot of not only homophobia, again, from our lenses of today, homophobia, misogyny, and even racism, in Islamophobia as well, in the Divine Comedy, that we can see as such, but it's incontestable. But then on the other hand, we can also see that Dante made some choices that were really, some people call them almost progressive in a certain sense, in the terms of under a light of the evolution of consciousness that collectively we have undergone in the last centuries. Take Beatrice, for example. She is a prominent female character in this huge Christian poem. Not the only one. There are many female characters that have a lot of importance, especially in Purgatory and Paradiso, but we'll see them. Take Beatrice. She's not a stereotypical lady at all. She's not a nice lady with Dante in particular. We'll see in Purgatory when they meet, when she meets finally Dante, she's a commanding presence. She is stern and almost dominating, at least from a moral and psychological point of view, versus the character of Dante the Pilgrim. So a lot of importance given and respect given to female figures as well. And let's think for a second about this concept of the sodomites, or broadly speaking, the sins against nature that Dante is representing here in this canto. He never states, he never explains in the canto what exactly we're thinking of, we're looking at when we talk about sins against nature. We already seen that he steers away from the typical imagery or medieval imagery when it comes to sexual sins and sexual punishments, and that's something in itself. Scholars around the world agree that we should think of these souls as the sodomites. Sodomites, but what does it mean? In biblical terms, that term comes from Sodom and Gomorrah, and how those hyper or excessive sexualized habits were punished by God. So that's for certain. That's where Dante also took the contrapasso punishment of the raining fire. We understand that at a basic level. However, we have to think also about his historic context, because Florence in his times, especially in the 1200 and 1300, in Florence, sodomy and a certain sexual lasciviousness had become almost endemic in the town, to the point that in terms of homosexual behavior, in Germany there was a term, Florenzer, or that means Florentine, that was used to call any homosexual man. That's how notorious Florence was in this respect. However, Dante doesn't really seem to care much about the sexual aspect or the physical aspect of this sin or Christian sin. He cares much more about the psychological, he cares about the desire aspect or the psychological aspect of the sin. He's thinking about people who still, just like in Canto 5, where we saw Francesca, people who put their reason under their desire. He never clearly states what kind of sin it is, but there is reason to believe that not only he is thinking about homosexual activities, but he is particularly thinking of a sort of such psychological abuse that would take place in the relationship between especially an adult, very often a literate, an intellectual, let's say, or even a member of the clergy, and a young boy or a teenage boy. And this is where the master and pupil relationship would degenerate into something sexual, to the detriment, to the psychological detriment of the pupil, of the boy. This type of relationship happened apparently a lot in his times, and that's a big part of what Dante intends to condemn in this canto as well. Most importantly, what we see in the Divine Comedy is that Dante is going to place homosexual men in purgatory. Not only a couple of individuals, but in fact, when we get to the terrace of lust in purgatory, 50% of it is going to be heterosexual lustful souls, and 50% of it is going to be homosexuals, which is completely non-normative for his times. It's unheard of, and even if it's a little bit difficult to build a theology around it because of the arguable nature of purgatory, the place purgatory, we know that all these souls are going to be saved. It's going to take some time, but everybody who is in purgatory, their soul is going to be saved. So the fact that Dante places homosexual men and people in purgatory means that his own general respect and attitude towards them was very different from what the norm was in his times. He could have simply put heterosexual lovers in purgatory. Nobody would have said anything about that. So it was really his choice. And that's what I find really interesting if we contextualize this really in his historic times. So there are obviously questions around it still, but very, very fascinating to think how somebody with that type of imagination and open-mindedness was able to go beyond what the cultural and social norms of his times were, at least to a certain degree. I believe to what it was possible for him as well. So let's jump into this third round of the seventh circle. We remember we've been crossing the river of blood, we've been crossing the deserted woods, and we are now with Virgil and Dante walking along this canal where the Phlegethon river and the bloody waters are running, crossing this desert and walking towards the next circle. It's magnificent here in opening this canto how Dante uses the words to give us the impression of this rain of fire. And I think here there is something that any English translation is not going to be able to replicate, which is at the very beginning of the canto, Pinsky says in the second terzina, as Flemings between Wisant and Bruges to defend against the tide that rushes in on them, construct a bulwark to drive the sea from land. This is how Dante is describing the borders of this canal. But the beauty from a linguistic point of view is that in Italian, Flemings is fiamminghi, Wisant is guizzante, and Bruges is brucia. And not by coincidence, fiamminghi has the root of the word fiamma, which means flames. It really sounds like flame. Guizzante, for Wisant, literally means darting, and brucia, for Bruges, means burning. So you have, in the same line, you have flames darting and burning, which is, I think, Dante's genius, how he puts images in your mind without even sometimes you realizing that he's doing that. It's incredible. Even a couple of lines below, he actually talks about the Carentana that feels the heat. That's another visual reference or sensory reference to the heat, the extreme burning heat of this location. So who was this Mr. Brunetto Latini? Dante really loved and respected this man very much. Brunetto Latini was a man who was about 30 years older than Dante. He was from Florence. He had distinguished himself for a political career. He was ambassador of Florence in Spain, so almost an international type of diplomat for their time. Extremely well read, extremely high-level, let's say, literate, because he was also a poet, a writer, a notary, which in Italy was a very high type of role, and also there is a little bit of a misunderstanding sometimes, thinking that Brunetto Latini was one of Dante's teachers. From a general pedagogic point of view, yes, he was, because they knew each other, and they certainly must have had a lot of conversations and discussions together, but never in an official, let's say, scholastic. He was never a school teacher, to be clear. He was more interested in politics and the classics and culture in general. Now, we have to remember that there are two major works that Brunetto Latini produced or worked on. The first one is called the Tesoro, or the Treasure, which he wrote in French, actually, because he was in exile in France for a while. And it was an encyclopedic work, something where he tried to condense a lot of the knowledge of their time. And the other work, it was called the Tesoretto, or Little Treasure. And in this Tesoretto, I find really fascinating the fact that there is almost a germ of the Divine Comedy, because Brunetto himself, we'll talk about it a little bit later, Brunetto puts himself in the Tesoretto as a character, and he talks about even some crisis, some life crisis that he was in. He even talks about being lost in the woods. So there is a lot that Dante took inspiration from Brunetto's works, and that's part of the reason why he gives him so much respect in this canto. Anyway, let's look at the conversation. They are walking, Virgil and Dante, through this canal border, and somebody in the darkness, or in the twilight, reaches out and pulls Dante's dress. There is a really beautiful image here of like somebody, they looked at them the way that men will look at one another at dusk, when daylight fails under a new moon, knitting their brows at us the way old tailors do when threading needles, squinting their eyes like that. One recognized me and took me by the hand, crying, "Why, what a marvel!" There is even an exclamation point in the original, "Qual meraviglia!" Brunetto Latini is rejoicing in seeing Dante. And the same happens from Dante's side. He actually looks at him with this a little bit arguable sentence, which is, "Are you here, Sir Brunetto?" Meaning, you are here. I'm surprised to see you here, but I'm actually the one writing this poem, so I shouldn't be surprised to see you. Why should Dante be surprised to see him there? He replied, "My son," and immediately we can see this master and pupil relationship, to the point that we clearly understand, I think at a basic level, why Virgil is almost completely silent for the entire canto, because there is a palpable rivalry between Virgil and Brunetto to be Dante's real master. We have the quintessential master for Dante, that's Virgil, and then we have his old master, Brunetto, and so Virgil stays a little bit on the side. "My son," the constant wandering of these sodomites, these souls, is comparable to the contrapasso of the lustful in Canto 5, like Francesca. The fact that this desire taking over reason is almost like an uncontrollable movement that never lets them rest. And spiritually, it's very similar. The fact that the sodomites here need to keep moving, keep walking, otherwise their punishment is going to be even worse. Dante is willing to get closer to Brunetto, but he can't. So he says, "I am afraid to step down, but I bent my head in reverence." He's got a very referential attitude towards Brunetto. Brunetto, by the way, is the only person in Inferno that Dante addresses with voi, which is a courtesy form in Italian. Now, in this use, is not being used anymore, but almost as if to say, you guys. And he uses this only with Brunetto, with Farinata, and with Cavalcante dei Cavalcanti, only with these three people. While Brunetto talks to him using you, not voi, tu. So Brunetto asks, what destiny or fortune makes you come before your final day? And who is this guide? Let's highlight the fact that this question is not going to be answered. Who is this guide? Virgil does not introduce himself, and Dante does not introduce Virgil. We don't know why. Now here, the next couple of terzines are extremely important because they summarize what has happened to Dante in Inferno until now, in a way that very closely matches the beginning of Canto 1, and at the same time very closely matches a certain portion of Tesoretto, which was this work of Brunetto Latini, where he himself was lost in a wood and started describing some allegories, some virtues in the form of creatures, taking some classical images as well. So there was a lot that Dante took in terms of ideas and inspirations from this work by Brunetto. And so in the bright life above, I came into a valley and lost my way before my age had reached its ripening time, which means before he was 35. In Mark Musa's translation, we find before the end of my days, and that's actually incorrect because the meaning in Dante's original version, he says before my full middle of my life, which is 35 years, not the end of his life. So yesterday I was there, I was going back in the woods, but I saw this guy and he's taking me home. I love how he says a casa, he leads me home to, doesn't know exactly where, but the meaning is clear. He's going back to his father, to God. Brunetto says that if his intuition is correct, if he has known Dante well, he knows that Dante will obtain a lot of glory in his life and after his life as well. Follow your star not only in terms of his natural inclination of being a genius or linguistic genius, but also the constellation under which he was born, which was the Gemini, that in his times was considered to be the sign of writers and artists. If I had lived a little bit longer, I would have wished your work good cheer. I would have supported your work even more. But, and here he starts going on about Florence again, the malignant folk, this is the Florentines, who descend from those who brought down from Fiesole long ago. This is the political aspect, again, that Dante cannot get away from, of course. Fiesole was this small town, very ancient, that according to a medieval legend, Catiline went and to seek refuge. And so as a consequence, the village was destroyed by the Roman Empire, by Caesar. Therefore, the people of Fiesole, the survivors, moved and settled in what then became Florence. And they were mountaineers, they were very uncultured people, and they mixed there with noble and very, let's say, civilized Romans. So you have this conflict in the heart of the origin of Florence that Dante is referring to, clearly saying that Dante, is a descendant of the Romans, while everybody else is a descendant of the Fiesole people, the Fiesole beasts. The tone that Brunetto is using has made a lot of people think about almost a certain flirty tone, maybe, especially when it comes to the comparisons that he makes for Dante. He says, you are the sweet fig, among the bitter sorb trees. It's seen some dew when the sweet fig in season comes to fruit. You're just a pearl among the pigs or something in Florence. Their people are greedy, envious, proud. He repeats exactly the same sins and the same words that Chaco repeated when referring to the Florentines. And in doing this prophecy, in stating his own prophecy, Brunetto, he introduces a new element, which is in the next portion, where he says, "You'll find your fortune holds such honor as will induce one party and the other to contend in hunger to consume you. They will want to devour you once you get famous, etc." All the Florentines, doesn't matter if they are on the white or the black side, Cerchi, Donati, all of them. Dante says that because at this point in writing the Divine Comedy, he had already broken or burned his bridges, even with the Cerchi, with his own faction, because being exiled, they wanted to organize with a new conspiracy, maybe potentially even take back Florence with violence, and Dante didn't want to have anything to do with that. So his wrath, in a sense, his anger, is towards most of Florence at this point, one party and the other. He's compared to the grass that is kept at a distance from the goat, which is the Florentines, always this type of sense of eating and comparison with eating. Spare the shoot, which is again Dante, the plant, in which the sacred seed is living yet, the Roman sacred seed, as we said before. So it's there is a lot of love and respect. There is somebody who said possibly Dante the poet is here mature and sees something that maybe Dante the pilgrim, or maybe Dante in his past, didn't see as clearly, which was a certain element of potentially physical desire from Brunetto to him. And it's not clear, but the fact that these similes are so delicious, almost talking about eating and devouring, made some scholar think about this aspect of their relationship. Dante is replying to Brunetto. He says, "Your image, dear, fatherly, benevolent, being fixed inside my memory, has imbued my heart. You taught me patiently. It was you who showed the way man makes himself eternal." Wonderful way to express it in Italian. Mi insegnavate come l'uomo s'eterna. You might say it in English in a way to say, you taught me how man eternalizes himself. And this is a great way to express how art, how any type of work of art allows us to become eternal in history. And this is a concept that comes back in this canto. Now, what you tell me of my future, I write. What I can do for you, Brunetto, is to do justice to your character and to your the respect I have for you by writing about you and writing about what you're telling me, and keep it with another text. He's referring to the other prophecy that Farinata gave him, another text, until both are glossed by a lady of good wit, Beatrice. At this point, Virgil pricks his ears and he congratulates Dante for being a great listener with a very controversial sentence. He says, "Bene ascolta chi la nota." You've been listening well. In Canto 10, Virgil had told Dante to do exactly what he's doing here. He had told him to record and pay a lot of attention to what Farinata told him and wait for Beatrice to then explain and articulate his future that was not clear in Farinata's prophecy. Doesn't matter that in Paradise is going to be somebody else who actually explains these prophecies to Dante. It's going to be Cacciaguida, one of his ancestors. But it's interesting how Virgil remembers that what he told Dante and congratulates him or says, "Well done, Dante." The canto ends with Dante asking Brunetto about who else is in this circle. And it's not too important to note who these people are, because one is He was a bishop who was moved from Florence to Vicenza, and he left his body distended in its nerve, Prisciano di Cesarea, etc. In my opinion, it does matter how Brunetto says goodbye in saying, I live in my tesoro, my memory and is in my work, the tesoro, and that is what makes me survive as well. And he went off, seeming to me like one of those who run competing for the green cloth in the races upon Verona's field. There was an annual festival or sport event where the winner was given this green drape. And so we can see the last image that we have of Brunetto is him running away very fast, very quickly, with this green drape almost, which is a little comical, a little ridiculous. And there is a little bit to speculate and try to understand why Dante seems to say he looked like one who gains the victory and not one who loses. He seemed to almost say he was a loser, but to me, he looks like a winner. So his effort is to rehabilitate Brunetto in his afterlife. That's all I have for this canto. Let's call it the tip of the iceberg. Hopefully you've enjoyed it, and I really look forward to hearing more comments and thoughts from you, or maybe from comments that you've read on your translations. Please let me know. This is one of those cantos that opens up endless discussions. In any case, thank you very much for watching as always. We'll talk again for Canto 16.